Good evening, everyone. I have a presentation tonight about port activity at the mouth of the Brazos River. I have been a member of several organizations that you see listed here, and the confluence of those different groups and their objectives has led me in retirement to have the time to do some research about the oldest Fort Velasco, built in 1832 by the Mexican Army. But what I found is that there was more than one fort at the mouth of the Brazos over several decades. So I call them the Forts Velasco. And I have been doing this for the last several years here. The original impetus was that we have for decades been wanting to build a replica of this fort at the location that is now Surfside. This is a modern map that shows the mouth of the Brazos River, or the original mouth right here. Let's see if I can spot some landmarks for you. So, this is the area of Freeport. Up here is Lake Jackson. Here comes the modern Brazos River. But in 1929, they built the dam in the river because it was washing out the wharves and docks in Freeport. And what was known then as New Velasco was on this side of the river. This section used to be called the New Velasco. The original Velasco was down here at the mouth of the river on the left bank, or the north side, that today has developed into a town called Surfside Beach. But what they did was they diverted the river straight south through what they call the New River, or a diversion channel, so that this could become basically a skinny Freeport harbor that wasn't suffering from floods and wiping out the riverside docks and things. So we locals call this the Old River, and we call this the New River. That's what you'll find on the maps today. The Velasco sat right here on this end of what is Follett's Island, and that's where I'll be talking about today. So the old Velasco, which existed until about 1891, used to exist here. So the remnants of that, it will feature prominently in the talk this evening. Well, let's go back a little bit. When Texas was part of New Spain, the first real detailed mapping was done by this fellow, Jose de Avia, at the behest of Bernardo de Galvez, who was the Spanish governor in New Orleans for Louisiana. And he commissioned him over a several-year period to survey the coast from Tampico all the way around to Apalachicola, Florida. And he spent each summer over here, and he did some detailed surveys of important inlets or bays. And this is the map that he produced for what today we call Matagorda and Lavaca Bays. It had quite a history with Spain because this was sort of the area where Fort St. Louis had been built. So the Spanish had put quite a bit of effort, into this particular bay. So you see here the mouth of the bay, today called Paso Caballo. This is the existing Matagorda Bay. And then this is Lavaca Bay up here, Garcitas Creek emptying into that. And also the Lavaca River is here. But at the time, his work product was these individual harbor maps. And he developed what was called a Portulano here. This particular original map is from Mexico City. And he had I don't remember, maybe 50, 60 such maps to describe that portion of the Gulf. He also did one for Galveston Bay. But this was the first real mapping coast, but the Spanish never let it out. They kept it secret So the maps of the area were very primitive for decades afterwards because they didn't share these details. But a few years later, fellows at the Spanish Admiralty put together all this information and produced maps of this sort right here. We zoom in on our Texas coast and we can see some things here. This is Sabine Lake. And after a great distance, you come to Galveston Bay. Here is East Galveston Bay, West Galveston Bay. But looky here. He apparently split his summers between Matagorda Island and Galveston Island, and he thought they were all one island. He called Isla de San Luis. So here is La Vaca Bay, Matagorda Bay, and what we now call East Matagorda Bay. This was all one bay in here. And, there were unknown areas on down the coast. But this is where our name, San Luis comes from after Fort St. Louis. But somehow it got imported over here to Galveston, and we have the San Luis Hotel and other things now up here. I don't think I mentioned, but the Brazos River is not to be seen on that map. Okay. He missed it. Jump ahead to 1817, just before Stephen F. Austin, came to form his colony. This is an interesting map for New Spain, all of North America, a very well done map. Of course, if we zoom in on the Texas coast, here's what we see. We see here's the Trinity River coming down into Galveston Bay, again, somewhat recognizable. But looky here, here's the Rio Brazos de Dios coming down, running into some kind of bay. And then he has the Colorado running into what looks like Matagorda Bay, incorrectly so. It comes in, here somewhere. And yet the San Antonio River all running into one bay. So even at this late point, the knowledge of our coastal geography was pretty poor because Spain didn't share some of those details. So when Stephen F. Austin arrives, this is the kind of information that he was presented with. One of the first, let me see if I, so the area in here was poorly known, and that's what Moses Austin and Stephen F. Austin discovered, is that this was a larger than mapped area, a wilderness that was ripe for colonization, and that's why they chose that area. One of the first things that happened at the Brazos was this was where Stephen F. Austin's first colonists came in on this little schooner called the Lively. It was in late 1821. The boat was supposed to go to the Colorado, but got lost. And after bad weather, it took them like a month to finally come back into the mouth of the Brazos, where they dumped off their people. It went back to New Orleans and brought another load, but grounded on Galveston Island and was lost. The passengers were not lost, but they did finally found their way, and they were the very first colonists for that coming in, to Austin's colony. The Brazos then became the main port of entry for Stephen F. Austin. There were not developed ports or towns or harbors for him to bring his people in. So the Brazos became sort of a linear port, dropping off these people over the next few years. This is one of Stephen's first maps. This was done in 1822. It's rich with information about prairies and forested areas that are the yellow and the blue. He's got a lot of comments. There's a lot of roads. And when you look close, there's a lot of notes about Indian villages. But look at that coastal geography. Okay, I guess this is Galveston Bay. And there's Isla de San Luis, but hardly any accurate bays are shown for the whole rest of the coast. So at this point, he didn't have much of an idea of, you know, where the Brazos was, or how to describe it. He does show it on the map here, but interestingly, in this version, he doesn't even label it by name. He did draw another version of it that is more directly showing the forested areas. Here's the Galvezton. And on this version, he does label it as the Brazos. So one of the things you may shoot me about, but did you know the Port of Galveston was first founded at the Brazos River? The Mexican government authorized such a port in 1825 at the request of Stephen. He had done so a year before in 1824, but they did not specify a location. The decree from the Mexican government is there on the left, and it doesn't say a whole lot. It does say the Port of Galveston is temporarily open to business. It will have a maritime customs house. And get this, the government, as soon as possible, will try to get the indispensable data in order to select the place where the port should be established permanently. Okay. So Stephen hired a boat from the Harrisburg sawmill of the Harris brothers. It was called a Mexicana and an associated rowboat. And he began to survey Galveston Island. I believe this was in early 1826. I think it was 16 days in February of 1826. And, he drew a sketch of the bay. Let's see what I have here. He surveyed it in February 1836 using this rented sloop called Mexicana. Austin's survey resulted in an approved chart of Galveston Bay and Island, although the chart was forwarded on to the governor of Coahuila, Tejas, and Saltillo, and from there to Mexico City, and it disappears from history after that. I don't believe we have a copy of that. It would be really nice to see that. Austin had been asked earlier by Mexican authorities to seek boats for the use of their detachments lower on the coast. And then after he used this, he chose to purchase it outright and transport it down to San Antonio Bay to turn over to the Mexican authorities for their outposts that were on the coast down there. These were like satellite posts, largely managed from La Bahia, from the garrison there, and turned it over to them. But the important thing for us, this is what Austin wrote to the Mexican authorities. He wrote to Jose Antonio Sauceda in March, about a few weeks after he did his survey. I have not been able to find a site near the harbor or in all of Galveston Bay which meets all of the circumstances necessary for the permanent establishment of a maritime town and customs house. The harbor itself is very safe and well sheltered, and entry is not difficult or dangerous for ships in 11 to 12 feet of water, but a pilot will always be needed. The whole of Galveston Island is so low that it is inundated by seawater whenever there are violent winds from the south, southeast, or southwest. The mainland above Point Bolivar is higher, but far removed from the port, and nowhere is there a stick of wood or permanent fresh water. So he continues, and get this. The mouth of the Brazos River has more advantages to establish the provisional customs, and for now it will be more comfortable for the inhabitants in general than any other point. It is located about 18 leagues to the west of Galveston and has from 7 to 10 feet of water on the bar, depending on whether it varies due to the growth of the river or the effect of the winds. It has enough wood and fresh water from the river. It is more in the center of the new colonies. It is populated. The Brazos River is navigable, and the main establishments are on its banks, and settlers can lower their products in times of growth in the river and provide all the aid and food necessary for the construction of houses and maintenance of the officers and the guard from customs. So Stephen, after using the Brazos for a number of years as the main port of entry, goes back to it and declares that it is under the authority of El Puerto de Galveston. There were some history of people camping on Galveston Island and even building structures, but apparently storms or tides had wiped them out. So that by the time of the Texas Revolution, there were really only two structures on the island, both of them Mexican customs settlements. In the Samuel May Williams paper, this fellow, George Fisher, wrote to Samuel May Williams in 1830, and he said, in Spanish and then Mexican usage, the term Galveston is also applied to a large section of the coast, as in La Costa de Galveston. So Galveston was not the location we know it today, a town at the end of Punta de Culebras, what they call the end of Isla de San Luis. But Fisher defined it as Aduana Maritima de Galveston to include an extensive coast from the Sabine River to Matagorda Bay. So this is a Spanish letter that George Fisher wrote to Samuel May Williams. So that's where the confusion may lie, is that it was an area, not a specific town. Even if Austin's colony grew rapidly, the Mexican politicians got wind that maybe these Anglo-American settlers in great numbers were not following the Mexican laws and customs and religion and practices. So they asked this young, talented officer, Manuel de Mier y Terran, to come and make a boundary commission to Texas. He used almost all of the calendar year of 1828 to visit. The treaty with Spain in 1819 had established the boundary between the United States and the Spanish, colony of Tejas. And in 1828, his ostensible reason was to come and survey this border. So he traveled, from Mexico through San Antonio to Gonzales, San Felipe de Austin, and then eventually Nacogdoches, where he spent the summer exploring this area. But his secret commission was to find out what the hell is going on in Texas, see if these rumors were true. What he found alarmed him. He wrote an influential report when he got back to Mexico, reporting his findings, and the politicians took it even further in this law of April 6, 1830, where among the many provisions was to build military forts in Texas to control the situation. And this was the birth of the military fort at the Brazos, is the reason that this Fort Velasco was ultimately built in 1832. Here is an improvement from Stephen F. Austin. He took Terran's information that Terran had gotten in that 1828 trip. They had met when Terran came through, and they almost became like friends. They saw things the same way for Texas in large measure. And he had this publisher in Philadelphia publish this map, which is much more accurate for the coastal geography and shows the emerging towns. Basically, at this point in time, 1830, 9 years after he has been colonizing, the only towns that exist are Matagorda here at the mouth of the Colorado, Brazoria, somewhat up the Brazos, Harrisburg up here on Buffalo Bayou, and of course the capital at San Felipe de Austin. Most of the settlement had been in the rural areas, in between those areas. But this is much improved over the 1822 map. The Brazos is prominently shown here, and their original fort that the original settlers had founded in this bend of the river is up there where Richmond, is today. Using that map as a backdrop, I've drawn on here the 6 military forts that Turan wanted to build, and indeed did make a start. He built Fort Tenochtitlan here in April 1830, high on the Brazos, just outside the boundaries of Austin's colony, which was the San Antonio Road between there and Nacogdoches. A month later, he built Barranco, Colorado, down here on the lower Lavaca River, which was the boundary line of Austin's colony, and he built it over here on the west bank, just outside the boundary of the colony. Later that year, they established Fort Anahuac here on the northeast corner of Galveston Bay. I believe they arrived in October and began settling there. In 1831, they built Titlan down here on the lower Nueces, and Tehran here at an important road crossing south of Nacogdoches. And it was not until 1832, the spring of 1832, that he built Fort Velasco, the only one directly upon the coast here at the mouth of the Brazos River. There were pre-existing garrisons, of course, at Bear and at La Bahia, and a few years before this, they'd even established a garrison up here at Nacogdoches. So can you sort of see how this rings Austin's colony to control those new immigrants? Back to George Fisher. George Fisher, this guy, he arrives in the summer of 1832 at San Felipe de Austin, and he announces that he is the administrador de Aduana Marítima de Galveston. But as you can see here from these newspaper articles of the time, he wishes to establish a customs house for Galveston at the mouth of the Brazos, the bar of the Brazos. This article here is to the editor of the Texas Gazette, Maritime Customs House of Galveston. This day I entered on the discharge of my duties. So this flim-flam man convinced Stephen F. Austin and the other authorities that he had been given authority by the government of Mexico to be this, but he really had been appointed by the prior Mexican government, and after they had a revolution, he was out of favor. He was the out of favor party, and he hightailed it to New Orleans and then came overland to San Felipe de Austin. And Austin believed him. So he let him get away with a lot of stuff. These are some subsequent articles. And late in May, after his arrival in early May, Customs House Galveston, notice is hereby given to captains, masters, owners, and commanders of vessels bound for this port or to any of the waters of Texas. And a lot of instructions. Again, he's based at the bar of the Brazos there in Lake May. Here, Customs House Galveston signals at the mouth of the river Brazos for guidance of navigators. And it shows the little, what do they call them? The range flags that fly at the port, what they mean to try to get over the Brazos bar. So this got George Fisher here in 1830 is acknowledging that still the Port of Galveston is being administered at the mouth of the Brazos. One neat thing that happened that summer was that the schooner Canyon was seized by George Fisher in June. You see, in those days, they had a law that you couldn't import tobacco. They called it high quality and low quality tobacco, and it was illegal to import that. But he found that this ship was bringing in tobacco, so he seized it at the mouth of the Brazos. Here's the article that was in the San Felipe newspaper. We also learned that some smuggled tobacco has been seized on the coast by the collector of Galveston. This is as it should be. And goes on with some more details. But Fisher had to personally guard this seized vessel for much of the month of June. But then he dispatched it down to Mexico to take some agricultural products there to recoup the fine. The fine was as much as it cost in those days to buy the whole ship. It was $16,000, they say, and that was a lot of money in those days. He picked those up at Matagorda Bay and went on to Veracruz and Tampico, to sell the cargo. So this really did not endear George Fisher to the Texians of the time. They had been given the right to trade without duties, and for a period of 7 years, from 1823 to 1830. This was right when that was ending, and they were not used to being taxed on their imports, and this came as quite a shock to them. Fort Anahuac, then, after the summer of 1830, late that year, was founded over at that corner of Galveston Bay. Today, you can still find archaeological remains of that fort. It was sort of a square fort made of stone and brick. It had two bastions. Here is an archaeological drawing that shows some remnants of it. Today, there's an asphalt road that goes right over the location of the old fort, and it's a little public park now. Has some historical markers like this. The guy they put in charge was a guy named John Davis Bradburn. He had spent a lot of his adult life in the service of the Mexican army, and he really went by Juan, and he was made the commander of this fort. George Fisher eventually came back there and was based there in 1831. At this point, you can sort of consider that the administration for the Port of Galveston switched over to Anahuac, but it had been there at the Brazos, for a number of years prior to that. Anahuac was an interesting, or perhaps poor, choice for the administration point of the Port of Galveston. You see, it was up here on a bluff, just where the Trinity River ran into Galveston Bay. In those days, there were two bays, actually. There was a reef across the bay that separated what was sometimes called Trinity Bay from Galveston Bay. And I believe it was 1828, an American in the service of the Mexican Navy had sounded the bay, and it's found in a little inset of David Burr's 1833 map of Texas, which is where I got this. But this redfish reef or redfish bar really prevented ships of any draft from actually reaching Anahuac. So here was this guy, George Fisher, trying again to be the administrator of the Port of Galveston, and he even demanded that the ships coming in and out call on him at Anahuac. But it was very hard to reach this. It was also very hard to hike from the Brazos all the way around to Anahuac to get your clearance. So this satisfied nobody. An outpost from Anahuac was established at the mouth of the Brazos River, though, in early 1831. A fellow named Captain James Lindsay and 10 soldiers were sent there, at that point. A visitor that arrived in March of 1831 reported there were 10 or 12 puny, dark-complexioned men at Captain Cotton's in uniforms, who I learned were Mexican soldiers stationed there to enforce the revenue laws. Mary Austin Holly visited later that year in October when she came aboard the Spica. Here there is a Mexican garrison. The tricolored flag is hoisted. the first signal of our approach to a foreign land. On our right, in front of their palmetto-roofed and windowless barracks, the lazy sentinels were walking their lonely rounds without excessive martial parade. Nor did the unturreted quarters of the commanding officer show forth much of the blazonry of a Spanish dawn. Okay, so she had some fancy writing. In September, a guy named Ignacio Dominguez was sent to replace Captain James Lindsay and also brought along 20 additional soldiers to this post. So this was not yet a fort, but it was considered an outpost, from Anahuac. This is a lengthy description. I won't read it to you, but it was by this guy, George Willick, in 1834 that described another outpost that was placed at the same time that they did at the Brazos out on the tip of Galveston Island, where the town of Galveston is today. And it basically describes a log cabin, pretty primitive, with the kinds of animals and skins they collected, the kind of stock they had, what vegetables they were growing, what the inside of this cabin looked like. And I tend to believe, even though I haven't found one for the Brazos, this was built at the same time by the same people. So I bet the one at the Brazos was very similar to this. Mirabeau Lamar observed in 1836 that this structure has subsequently been consumed as fuel for the Yellowstone. So of the two buildings that were present at the start of the Texas Revolution here, where Galveston is today, one was destroyed during the Revolution as fuel for the steamer. Here's a document I found. I think this is from the Samuel May Williams papers, but it shows the ship traffic out of the Brazos in this period of the middle part of 1831. A total of 9 ships, 7 schooners, and 2 sloops were listed, and they were charging some duties, carrying a total of 399 tons, earning 99 pesos. It was 2 reales per ton. Was I forget the term, but it was a small charge that they made. The same documents where I found this one also has a very similar report from Anahuac for Galveston Bay, listing 195 pesos, or about twice as much. For a total of 294 pesos total from these two places for the El Puerto de Galveston. This probably indicates that the Brazos Customs House actually began on the 1st of March, as that's the first entry. So, okay. Here's another little report that talks about the unit there at the mouth of the Brazos in a muster list for Anahuac. This order that George Fisher issued from Anahuac, that ships had to personally call on him at Anahuac, irritated Edwin Waller and William Martin. So in December of 1831, they were the owners of 2 schooners. One was called the Sabine and one was called the Nelson. So they just decided to run the mouth of the Brazos. So they charged out of the mouth of the Brazos one day, one following the other, and they sailed past this military camp. Small arms fire was exchanged. One of the Mexican soldiers injured Captain Fuller on the Nelson, who was standing at the helm, and one of the passengers, a guy named Patrick Jack, perhaps you know that name, picked up Captain Fuller's rifle and shot the same Mexican soldier that had fired at Captain Fuller. This is probably the first example of anti-government bloodshed in the lead up to the Texas Revolution. The second customs house was built by that same Harrisburg lumber mill the Harris brothers, I think it was run by William Harris and Robert Wilson, and they built a lumber house on Galveston Island as the second Mexican customs house. This was done in 1832 here, and we've also found a description of it. But it was a pretty sturdy one, and this is the one that survived the Texas Revolution on the island. Later, this would become the headquarters for post Galveston in the immediate period after the Texas Revolution. But given all this activity, especially this incident with the Sabina Nelson, Tehran, now ensconced as the head of the Eastern Interior Provinces of Matamoros, decided he needed a full fort at the mouth of the Brazos. So in early 1832, he sent this guy, Domingo de Ugartechea, a lieutenant colonel. He went on the Topaz, and he first disembarks at Anahuac with some of his soldiers and supplies. Bradburn writes a letter mentioning the name Fortaleza de Velasco. This is the first mention I can find of this name. Eventually then they transfer over to the Brazos, and in the period of April to June 1832, they construct the first Fort Velasco. It was a circular structure with two palisade walls filled in between with sand partially for a sentry walking surface, a plaza area in the middle with a large sand mound on top of which was a palisade, and it was crowned with a naval 9-pound cannon that could rotate on a pivot 360 degrees. This is a diorama constructed in the 1970s. At that time, it was believed it was a fairly large fort, but in the 1990s, a drawing came to light that shows it was a lot smaller. Let's see if I have that. Bradburn was considered somewhat autocratic at Anahuac and had thrown some people in jail, including these Jack brothers and William Barrett Travis, and it created a dispute known as the Anahuac disturbances. And the people at Brazoria supported their fellow Anglo-American settlers over there and their militia, and they tried to sail past Velasco to bring cannon and militia over to Anahuac. But Ugartechea refused passage. It led to the Battle of Velasco in the summer of 1832, the last few days of June, and Texas and Mexican dead were buried near this fort. The battle plan consisted of coming down the Brazos with the schooner called the Brazoria that had its own cannon and was carrying the cannon for Anahuac. It was to engage the fort in the darkness, causing the Mexicans to retreat into the fort while land forces circled the fort and were supposed to attack at dawn to overwhelm the fort. It didn't quite happen that way. The schooner was hit by the 9-pounder, grounded. The soldiers here were discovered in the darkness, and as they said, the fort erupted like a volcano. Quite a few casualties were on each side that came with the improved accuracy of light at dawn. The location of this fort was suspected for many years to be in Monument Square. This is an 1837 plat of Velasco that's in the approximate location at the corner. But subsequent research has shown that it actually exists across the street on property belonging that later became the Archer House and the Shandon family property. We did a geophysical survey in the year 2020 and found it right here on the Shandon property. You'll notice here also they're showing a battery for the Republic of Texas. This was a year after the Texas Revolution. This is Fort Velasco number 2. In 1999, this document was discovered showing this fort that I showed you a minute ago. But looky here, it has a scale. It was drawn by a guy named Edward Harcourt, who sent this back to Germany before dying here in Galveston Bay in late 1836. But you've got the fort here, and from this scale, we can estimate its size of just less than 100 feet. So relatively modest fort. This is that same Austin map, but updated to 1836. And it does show additional towns cropping up. One called Bolivar here, Columbia, Powhatan over here on Galveston Bay, and others. But, not too much changes. Now I'm going to run through some events that happened at the mouth of the Brazos to show you how it was used as a port. Have y'all ever heard of the San Felipe Incident? This is the real opening shot of the Texas Revolution. The schooner San Felipe was coming in from New Orleans. It had a guy on board. It was afternoon of the 1st of September, 1835. His name was Stephen F. Austin. He'd been in Mexico for 2 years, most of it in prison. He was not in a good mood. As they approached the mouth of the Brazos, they were beating in for Velasco. Up appears the Correo Mexicano, an armed Mexican schooner that had been told to blockade the coast. Fortunately, the San Felipe had the wind and made it across the bar, dropped off Stephen F., and the owner, McKinney, of McKinney and Williams at Quintana, sent it back out with his little river schooner, the Laura, to challenge the Correo. Had a late afternoon gun battle and overnight sea chase. Eventually, the Laura pulled the San Felipe into gun position that the Correo could not match, and it surrendered. They sent the ship and its officers to New Orleans to be charged with piracy. Stephen F. Austin watched from the beach. A week later at Brazoria, he gave a stem-winding speech speaking for revolution against Santa Anna. That speech was published verbatim in the newspapers, and one of them reached Gonzales, emboldening those men a month later to have something called the Battle of Gonzales, which is falsely said to be the first shot of the Texas Revolution. Mm-hmm. No, it happened just off the mouth of the Brazos with a sea battle. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. This image here is from a sign that we had made for the Jettyside Trail. I'll get to that in a minute. We also have one you'll like to know about the Republic of Texas First Navy and how it used the mouth of the Brazos heavily, in the times of the Texas Revolution, these 4 schooners. Here are some examples of naval activity at the Brazos. I don't think I have time to go over that, but I've picked out some examples where they were getting water or sailors or Marines at the ports at the mouth of the Brazos. Here's a quote from the Texas Almanac. For the purposes of facilitating the supply and control of the vessels, the government commissioned Thomas F. McKinney, a captain in the Navy, with authority similar to that vested in a Secretary of the Navy. He then resided at the mouth of the Brazos, the usual naval rendezvous and most frequented port of entry for Texas. So he was originally scheduled to command the Invincible, but turned that over to a guy named Jeremiah Brown, another mariner at Velasco, and the brother of Jeremiah, William, took the liberty. These are some details about the Republic of Texas battery. I found this document in the Nacogdoches archives. It's a polygon-shaped fort, which is possibly, this battery. The words are in English. It might have been drawn by Edward Harcourt. It says it's Fort Velasco, but it had to have occurred before 1836. So this must be that fort. And this image is, again, the sign that we prepared. Oh. The building that Jeremiah Brown and his brother-in-law, Isaac Hawkins, built and operated together with their wives this is thought to be an image of it many years later, was actually the first capital of the Republic of Texas after San Jacinto. This was published in a newspaper article in September of 1932. Here are notes, and they call it a warrant of payment that's signed here at Velasco. And it became the seat of government from May to October 1836, when they had the first election in the Republic of Texas, elected some guy named Sam Houston, and they all decided to move to West Columbia. They settled in Velasco because it was one of the few towns that wasn't burnt in the Revolution. It had that fort right there. It had the Texas Navy, so it was considered the most protected spot in Texas. Okay, I'm running short on time. Okay, let me hurry. And of course, Santa Anna was brought there as prisoner and signed the treaties of Velasco. So we like to say the Texas Revolution started and ended within yards of each other at old Velasco. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. As years go by, this area developed into a little port town called Velasco, and Quintana was over here at this corner of the river. Again, this is the Monument Square and the Archery House and the Shannon House. This is the first map we have before we reach the Civil War, when a whole complex of forts were built at the mouth. The one here was the third Fort Velasco, and then it was replaced by a much bigger fort, this one right here. And then it had a lot of roads and bridges. There were redans and emplacements all around to protect this river later in the Civil War. So the third and fourth Fort Velascos. Our little historical group at Surfside has tried to interpret this history by putting up a series of 6 signs. This is the one for the Texas Navy along the Jetty Side Trail on the Surfside side. Some years ago, they built a circular fence structure to simulate the original Fort Velasco. We call it the Timeline Circle now. A year and a half ago, we put up a structure, monument for the Battle of Velasco that was actually described in an 1833 article, but never built. And this year, our project has been to landscape the area around it and put this little plaza, 2 historical markers, 2 flagpoles at the other 2 corners. And we're still in the process of finishing this. These ramps will hold granite plaques naming all of the survivors of the battle, whereas on this monument are carved the few names we have of the people who died and are probably buried right there at Monument Square. That's what Monument Square is, not the location of the Mexican fort. It's where those Texan militia were buried. We even have to fly on those flagpoles. We have had custom made a Brazoria District militia flag, that we're going to fly from those flagpoles for special events. We have documented a lot of this on a website here, our fantabulous website. You may wish to find that. You can find it by searching the Forts Velasco, but this is the URL address. This is my name and contact information if y'all wish to follow up on anything. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Do you have any questions? Oh, yeah. Seriously. I'm sorry, I'm just a history buff that does this for fun.